We're going to start on page 22 in your book today. Open up to page 22. Let's get into this. Good stuff today. Ready? Good. I can just sense the enthusiasm.
Yeah.
That way. All right, remember, we're going to learn the 13 original colonies. First of all, review. Remember we said when we look at this map, at least while we're the colonies, what country are we looking at?
England.
It's England, right? Now we know it's going to become a separate country called the United States of America someday, but during this time period, that's the 1600s. Remember, it all started in Jamestown in 1607, right? And that's going to become the colony of Virginia. We'll tell that story later in the week. And it goes all the way up to the 1770s before it becomes a separate country, the United States. So during that time, it's all England. There are 13 separate English colonies. By separate, I mean like right now we're the United, we're going to become the United States. At first it was 13 United States, now it's 50 United States. But at that time it was 13 separate English colonies. They're not united with each other. They're all England, but they're not united with each other, one colony to another. It's important to understand as we go through here. Each of the 13 colonies has its own separate story. We'll spend more time on some than others. Today we're going to talk about Massachusetts. In fact, that's such a cool story, it's going to take us 2 days to talk through Massachusetts. All right, but each one has their own story. Now, if you look up here on my map, you can see that it's kind of color-coded, right? On the orange ones, we call those the New England colonies. Happens to be 4 of those. The ones in the green, we call the middle colonies. Real creative name, huh? There's 4 of those. All right, and in the blue, we call those the southern colonies. There's 5 of those. Now, the only reason we group them this way, they didn't group them that way in those days, during the colonial days. We group them that way just because it makes it easier to learn about them. So every textbook does the same thing. New England colonies, middle colonies, southern colonies. Now, if you look in your book on page 22, you will see a map just of the New England colonies. If you flip to page 28, you have a separate map of the middle colonies. And then on page 31, there's a map of the southern colonies. It's all the same. I have it on one map, you have it on 3 separate maps, but it's all the same. It's the 13 original English colonies. Today we're going to talk about 2 groups of believers in England that weren't happy. And it's because of religion. First of all, let's think of something we already know about England. What was their religion? Now this is important to remember things we've already learned. If we can't remember things we've already learned, then we won't always understand the story. We'll be scratching our head a lot all year long. It'd be kind of like starting a movie in the middle. A movie's a story, right? And start a movie in the middle and you just watch the last half of it, you're probably a little confused about what's going on. Right? Because you missed the first hour. Right? So if we learn things like what religion England was, and then don't remember it, then this story doesn't make sense. So let's remember, what do we know about England? What was their religion? Caitlin?
Protestant.
They were Protestant as a result of the Protestant Reformation from 1517. We already talked about that. So that's good because Protestant meant that people could be influenced by God's Word. Going to be a lot of godly people. All right. We know the Pilgrims. We're going to tell their story today. The Pilgrims were godly people. They wanted to worship God the way they thought was right. And they're a big part of our story, right? And they came here for religious freedom because they didn't have religious freedom in England. Good news, England is Protestant. Bad news, that doesn't mean their country had religious freedom. There was no religious freedom in England in those days. the government in the church, that's weird to us, right? They're separate to us, but in England in those days, it's the same thing. Right? They had an official religion, no religious freedom. Again, that's weird to us because now in America, that's one of the pillars of our greatness, right? We have religious freedom. We can worship how we want, who we want. We don't have to have any religion. The government can't tell us how to worship, right? We have freedom of religion. Well, they didn't have that in England. There was an official religion. It was called the Church of England. Real creative name, huh? The official religion in England was the Church of England. Also known as the Anglican Church. They mean the same thing. Anglican Church, Church of England, same thing, but it's the official religion of England. If you lived in England, you must worship in a certain way. It's Protestant, but you don't have freedom. Now, there's two groups of people we're going to talk about who didn't necessarily agree with all the requirements of the Church of England. One of those groups, you'll see them in bold print on page 22, are the Puritans. Here's what the Puritans thought. They thought they wanted to change or fix the Church of England. In fact, that's where they get their name. They wanted to purify the Church of England from within. In other words, the Puritans said, these are the things we disagree with, Church of England. We want you to change and do things right. We want to purify you from within. We want you to get with the program and worship God the right way. All right, that's how they get the name Puritans. We're going to tell their story tomorrow. We'll see how that works out for them. All right, the other group, you'll also see in bold print, they're called separatists. They're similar to the Puritans in that they disagree with some of the teachings of the Church of England. But they're different from the Puritans is that they don't want to change the Church of England. That's not what they're about. They just want to separate themselves and do things their own way. That's why they get their name, the separatists. Again, Puritans want to change the church. Separatists just want to leave the church. So the separatist attitude is, hey, Church of England, there's some things we disagree with you on, so you do things your way. We don't expect you to change to make us happy. We just want to be left alone. We're going to separate ourselves and worship the way we want. Now, is that going to be legal in England? No. No. Church of England is the official religion. You're not allowed to separate yourself. You got to follow the law. So the separatists, as a result of that, they do start worshiping on their own. They don't go to the Church of England. They meet together and worship the way they want, and that's against the law. So they're persecuted. One of the ways they're persecuted is their leaders. The separatist leaders. There were warrants for their arrest. They could be arrested and put in jail. Now, just because you worship as a separatist doesn't mean you're going to be put in jail, but if you're one of the leaders, you'll be arrested. But all separatists are going to have a hard time making a living because you can't get a job. You can't keep a job. If your boss finds out you're one of those weird separatists, they're going to fire you. They're not going to hire you to begin with. Good luck providing for your family. Then you might think, well, my family has their own business. They don't have to ask somebody for a job. Well, there were separatists that might have had their own business, but any business needs customers in order to succeed, right? You name the business, it's not going to do anything without customers. Well, once people in England found out that this business was owned by separatists, they're not going to be customers there. Bunch of weird separatists not doing business there. All right, so no matter what, separatists were struggling. They're being persecuted. Why? It's because of their faith. So they have a choice. They could cave in, turn their back on their faith, and just do what everybody tells them to do. But that's not how they are. Their faith is important to them. It's their deeply held beliefs. They're not going to change, worshiping God the way they see fit. So they make a very difficult decision. They decide to move. The town they're in is Scrooby, England. They're going to move. All right, I got some questions for you. I bet the first one, most of us in here will raise our hand. Alright, has anybody ever moved from one house to another? Maybe not all of us, but I bet most of us have, right? Raise your hand if you've moved from one house to another. Okay, I've done that. Alright, how about have you ever moved from one town to another? Raise your hand. I moved from Cape Coral to Fort Myers a few years back. That's not that uncommon. Alright, I bet there'll be fewer hands up this time, but still some of us. Raise your hand if you've moved from one state to another. You've lived in another state besides Florida. Yeah, I think I've lived in 4 different states in my life. Alright, so we're getting fewer people with their hands up, right? How about this one? Might be nobody, might be a few. Not me though, I can't raise my hand anymore on this one. Raise your hand if you've moved from one country to another. Just one, I see.
I was born there,
Where were you, what country?
Ukraine.
Okay. So move from Ukraine to the United States, right?
I was born in Fort Myers and I live in Lehigh.
Well, you moved towns, right? So, it's not uncommon to move, but moving from one country to another, we got less common, right? Only one of us in the classroom has ever done that. Well, that's what the separatists decided to do. They said, we can't stay in England. It doesn't matter if we move from Scrooby, England to another town in England. It's still gonna be the official Church of England and we're not gonna have our religious freedom. So they decided to pack up and move from one country to another. And what country did they choose? Can anybody see that? Where did the separatists move to? Kiana? Karina?
They moved to the Netherlands.
They did. They moved to the Netherlands, Holland, same thing. And that's a big move, right? Because they speak a whole different language. Obviously in England they speak English. In the Netherlands they speak Dutch. All different customs and cultures. But here's why they chose the Netherlands. In the Netherlands there was no official religion. You didn't have to worship a certain way. In fact, there wasn't much religion at all in the Netherlands. Not only no official religion, hardly anyone in the Netherlands went to church or worshiped in any way. Kind of a wicked culture. Some things don't change. The Netherlands is still known for that today. All right? It's a pretty wicked culture. Not a lot of churches, not a lot of people that are believers of any religion. Well, that's why the separatists chose the Netherlands, because at least the government wouldn't tell them how to worship. They would have their religious freedom. And that worked out, but after they lived there a little while, they decided this isn't gonna work either, because now they got a whole new problem. While they're living in the Netherlands, their children are being influenced by the wicked culture. They're losing their children to this wicked culture. Now that we can kind of relate to a little bit. I know you're young, and I know you haven't learned a whole lot about American history, but I think you've caught on to this. Throughout the years and decades and generations that our country's been here, is it getting more or less godly, our society? Less godly. I think you picked up on that, right? So, as you're growing up in America, it's harder to do what's right because the temptations are everywhere. It's harder for your generation than it was for your parents. And guess what? Your parents had a harder time growing up without being influenced by the wicked culture than your grandparents did. Unfortunately, we're not getting more godly, our society gets less godly. In fact, that's probably at least one of the reasons why many of your families decided to send you to ECS, because we have a pretty messed up society. It's to the point where people are calling what's good evil, and what's evil they consider it good. They get things backwards from God's word. So, public schools are a whole different environment than ECS. If you've been to a public school, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, take my word for it. It's a very different environment. Not only don't they have Bible class and chapel, it's just a completely different environment. And maybe one of the reasons why your parents wanted you at ECS is because if their faith is important to them, they want you to grow up in that faith, and they don't want so many distractions and temptations, ways that you could go away from your family's faith. Well, that's what the separatists were dealing with in Holland. Yeah, they got freedom to worship the way they want, but their children are being influenced by their wicked culture. So one day after church, the separatists have a separate meeting to discuss their problems and what their options are. What are we gonna do? I bet somebody said, well, I guess we could go back to England. Somebody else says, that's not an option. You know what happens there, we won't have our freedom of religion. Well, we can't stay here, we're losing our kids to the bad culture. By the way, the year is 1620 when they're having this meeting. Wait a minute, that means the year before was 1619. That should ring a bell. Who arrived in Jamestown for the first time in 1619? Anybody remember? Back to our old story from last week. Some groups of new people arrived in Jamestown in 1619. Do you remember, Ethan?
Slaves?
Slaves, but that's not the one I'm thinking about. There was another group. That'll be a story for a different day. Tia?
Women and children.
Yeah, women and children and families. So I bet you at this meeting, one of the separatists said, hey, wait, I saw this on the news. Alright, just last year, over in Jamestown, I mean, this is an English colony. They had lived in England for a while, right? They understood. Way back in 1607, there was a settlement that went to the New World and it survived, didn't it? Well, that's been in the newspapers over in England. And just last year in 1619, it was so well established and so safe that they took families over there, women and children. So then the separatists get an idea. Hey, if they can do it, why can't we do it? We can't go back to England. We can't stay here. There's no freedom of religion anywhere else in Europe. Why don't we go to the New World? Start our own settlement. And there we would be able to worship God the way we want. That's what they decided to do. Now that is a bold step. I bet if I asked you to raise your hand on that, nobody in here would be able to raise your hand on that. They are going to leave everything behind and start a new life in a brand new harsh wilderness. None of us have done that. That's what these separatists decided to do. I'm sure some of them said, man, that's a little too adventurous for me. I'm not going to go, but I'll pray for the rest of you. But enough of them decided to do it. By the way, we know in America, we call these separatists by another name. What do we call them? David?
Pilgrims?
We call them the Pilgrims. Puritans and Pilgrims, two separate groups. Remember, Puritans want to change the Church of England. Pilgrims, who are separatists, just wanted to leave it, and now they've decided not just to leave the Church of England, not just leave England, but they are leaving all of Europe, going to take a dangerous trip across the ocean and start a life all over in a new world, in a wilderness, just so they can worship God the way they want. I think you can see their faith is very important to these people, isn't it? Their relationship to God and how they worship. These are the Pilgrims. So, they start making plans. First of all, in order to go to the New World, you need permission. We call it a charter. Permission from England's government to go start a colony in the New World. Because after all, we've already said these are English colonies. They're part of England. So if you're going to go settle here, well, you're going to need permission from the English government. It's called a charter. Well, the Pilgrims obtained a charter. The English government's like, well, a bunch of weird separatists, let them go. So they got their charter. Now they need to hire some ships. Somebody to pay somebody to take them over, right? Well, they actually join up with another group of people who are not pilgrims. It totals about 100 people. Alright, the pilgrims had a name for those who took this trip with them that were not pilgrims. What did the pilgrims call the other people that are gonna go across the ocean with them to start this new world, new colony in the new world? What did the pilgrims call it? Anybody see that? Mitchell, you see it?
Plymouth?
Well, that's where they sailed from. That's the name of the town where they sailed from.
Oh, wait.
What do they call the other people on the ships?
Strangers.
Strangers. Alright, so together we got pilgrims and non-pilgrims, which the pilgrims call strangers. About 100 of them. It's already September when they finally get ready to set sail. Hold on a minute. We're almost to September, and that September is smack dab in the middle of hurricane season in the Atlantic, right? We've already got 2 storms coming to our shores, not Florida, thank goodness we dodged this one, right? But you're gonna hit somebody, I think Louisiana, right? Well, September is usually even worse storms, and they haven't even started their trip yet. Usually, you should be here. You should already have finished your trip by May, maybe June at the latest. It's already September, they haven't even left yet. So some of the pilgrims were saying, wait, maybe we should wait till the spring. It's kinda late in the year to start sailing across the ocean, pretty dangerous. Well, they couldn't do that. Because remember, some of their leaders, their pastors, there were warrants for their arrest. They would have to stay in hiding. They would risk getting arrested before they would ever even get to leave to go to the new world. So they said, no, let's go, let's just go, God will protect us. Alright, so again, 100 people, pilgrims and strangers, they get on board 2 ships. One of them is called the Mayflower, the other one's called the Speedwell. Neither one of them are any good, they're both a piece of junk. But I think you've learned this already in your life, you get what you pay for. A lot of times, you get what you pay for, right? If you don't have much money and all you can get is an old junker car, might break down, right? If you can buy a good quality newer car, that's better, but that's gonna cost you more, right? You get what you pay for, even with education. You can get a free education, yeah, in a public school. And then you get a diploma, but that doesn't mean you know anything, that means you actually have an education. Our country is full of people who have high school diplomas, get this, worse yet, college degrees, and they're still ignorant. They never learned anything. They don't really have an education, they just have papers saying they're educated. That's a little different than actually knowing something, right? Here at ECS, I remind you all the time in history class, when we have tests and quizzes, I expect you to actually know some history. I want you to be educated. We're not just here to pass you on through, right? We want you to learn. Get what you pay for. ECS education costs a lot of money, but you get what you pay for. Alright, well, pilgrims and separatists, they get what they pay for with these ships. They got 2 pieces of junk. They get on board, they set sail from the town of Plymouth in September, and they only sail a few days, and the Speedwell is leaking. Is leaking water into their ship faster than they can bail it out. They realize there's no way we're gonna make it all the way across the ocean in this piece of junk. So all of them, they turn around, they come back to England, and they all get on board the same ship. That's the Mayflower.
They
Now
come
there's
all the way back to
100 people. It's even later in September. This is a small ship to begin with. It was already crowded. Now it's even more crowded. 100 people, all their belongings. And they're setting sail. And this ship is nothing to brag about. It's not in very good shape either. It's just better than the other one. And it's September, and they're sailing across the ocean. And sure enough, they hit a storm. Now, unlike us, they don't have the weather app on their phone. Alright, they can't see the forecast. They don't know that there's going to be a storm, let alone where it's gonna hit. Like right now, we know there's some storms and we know we are safe here in Southwest Florida. We're praying for those that are in the path, but we know we're good. Sometimes we're the ones in the path. Alright, but the pilgrims on the Mayflower, they didn't know. All they know is it's getting windy. Seas are getting kinda choppy. Next thing you know, they're in the middle of a violent storm. They pull down all their sails, they get everybody below deck, the bottom of the ship, and they are at the mercy of the waves, being tossed around. They are praying, they are crying, screaming out loud. Babies are crying. Moms and dads are crying. People are vomiting everywhere from the seasickness. This is not good. The mast, the main mast of the Mayflower, that all the sails attached to, goes all the way through the deck to the bottom of the ship. It's like the backbone of the ship. It's what holds it together. It cracks. If that thing breaks, they're done. They're not gonna survive. It cracks, but it holds. Finally, the storm subsides and they have survived it. Phew. Dangerous trip. They finally make it to the New World. But they have been blown off course. Maddox, sit up. They've been blown off course by that storm. They were supposed to, remember, they have a charter, right? Permission. They were supposed to settle in what's today Virginia, not too far from Jamestown, where the first English settlement was. That's what their charter says. But the storm blew them up to here. So they're supposed to be at the Chesapeake Bay, and they're at what we call today Massachusetts Bay. Excuse me. Way off course. When they figure this out, the pilgrims just tell the captain of the Mayflower, well, let's get back on the ship and let's sail down where we're supposed to be. And the captain says, no way. This ship is so badly damaged, this ship isn't going anywhere until I have a chance to fix it, and in the spring, I'm going back to England, and if you're smart, you'll go with me. So they're stuck here. They're supposed to be here, that's where their charter is, but they're up here. Now they got an even bigger problem. It's already December. Right? It's December in Massachusetts. We're familiar with December in Florida. Probably gonna be sunny and 85, right? Not in Massachusetts. It's probably 5 is the high. Alright, frigid cold, ice, everything's frozen. It's already December. They don't have any shelters built because they left so late. But their biggest problem is they can't get off the ship. If they get off the ship, they're doomed. Because their charter is only good if they settle where they have permission to go. They don't have permission to be up here. So if they get off the ship here, this charter, these rules aren't worth the paper they're written on. So they will get off the ship with no rules in place to restrain their behavior. Now you might think, no rules, freedom. They're looking for freedom. They got it. Wrong. Having no rules is not freedom. Nobody's happy in that situation. That's called anarchy. That's chaos. Right? Imagine if the first day of school we'd have come in here and I would have made an announcement, everybody's going over their rules and all that. And what if I would have said, in history class, we will have no rules. You can do whatever you want. There's no rules. You can't break any rules because there are no rules. I can't punish you because you can't do anything wrong because there's nothing against the rules. No OWs, no punishment of any kind. Just do whatever you want. Freedom. That would not be good. How much history do you think we've learned this year? 0, right? Because we come in here and some of you be playing hockey or throwing footballs around, breaking windows, knocking out ceiling tiles. Did I give you an OW?
Mm-mm.
No, we haven't broken any rules. There are no rules. Alright, and some of you don't enjoy that, would be sitting in the corner, man, I hate this. Can't wait till this period's over. It'd just be chaos. And even those that are running around here, after a while, you'd be sick of it. Because there's no rules in your game either. Everybody does just whatever they want. We'd be throwing desks out the window. There'll be fights in the room, be throwing each other out the window, that's not against the rules. There's no rules. It'd just be chaos, anarchy. Nothing would get done. Nothing would be accomplished. Well, the Pilgrims understand that. If they get off the ship and their charter doesn't apply, there's no written rules, it's every man for himself, none of them will survive. They will all die in this harsh wilderness. They understand that in order for anything worthwhile to get accomplished, people have to work together for a common cause. I hope you've learned that in your life. Everything worthwhile requires working with other people for a common cause. Alright, think about if you're involved in fine arts, if you're in a choir, or a band, or putting on a play. Can everybody just do their own thing? No, you gotta all be on the same page working together, right? To accomplish anything. How about a sports team? You got a team and everybody on the team just playing for their spotlight, for their own glory. The team's not gonna be successful. The teams that win are the ones that have teamwork. They work together for a common goal. You're performing not so you can get attention, you're performing to help your team succeed. Alright, how about a business? There's some businesses where everybody just says, I just work here, and they don't really care. And those businesses don't do as well. Businesses that really prosper are the ones where they convince everybody to work hard so the business can succeed. How about a family? Families fall apart when individuals in the family say, I'm gonna do what's good for me. I'm gonna do what I wanna do. They fall apart when family members sacrifice for the good of the family. Then that family's a strong, successful family. It's always that way. Well, the Pilgrims aren't stupid. They know without a charter, without anything in writing to restrain their behavior, and they get off this ship, they will all die because there'll be no rules. Alright, so if Peter has a good day and he finds some food, he's going hunting or whatever, we get off this ship, we're pilgrims, he finds some food for his family, there's no rules in place, I didn't have a good day, I just hit him over the head. Now my family has food. Did I break any rules? No. There are no rules. That might be going fine until Ben sees that my family has food, and then Ben, he hits me over the head. And now his family. So I didn't gain anything. I mean, it's every man for himself. None of us are gonna survive long like this, right? So what did they do? Well, if you look on the top of page 23, there's a picture in your book showing what they did. This is the passengers on the Mayflower, the pilgrims and strangers alike, signing a document we call in history the Mayflower Compact. This is a big deal. We know what Mayflower means, that's the name of the ship they're on, right? Compact is just a word that means agreement. So you think of this as the Mayflower Agreement. What are they agreeing to? Well, at the bottom of page 23, it describes the Mayflower Compact, but I'll summarize it for you. It didn't literally say it in these words, but basically this is the message of the Mayflower Compact. It says, we don't know what rules we're gonna need yet, but when we get off the ship and figure out these rules, we're gonna implement some rules, and then I agree to follow them, signed below. That's pretty much what it says. Now, once they figure out how to get organized and what kind of rules and laws and guidelines and standards they're gonna set up, they are agreeing that they will follow them for the good of everybody. It won't be every man for himself. There'll be rules in place and punishments if you break those rules, so that we're forced to work together. That way we have a chance to succeed. Because anything worthwhile requires cooperating with others. The Mayflower Compact, a huge moment in our history. Now they can get off the ship. Where they stepped off the ship onto a rock, they named it Plymouth Rock. Because remember, they set sail from the town of Plymouth, England, so they just named where they got off the ship Plymouth Rock, so kind of like they went from Plymouth to Plymouth. And now it's already winter, right? It's December 20th, almost Christmas. it's a rough winter. In fact, it's so bad that first winter, half the people from the Mayflower died. Half the Pilgrims already dead. Men, women, children, babies, infants. Think of it, everybody on that ship had a family member that died that first winter. Imagine we've been there, your dad, your mom, both, your older brother or sister, your little brother or sister, you, somebody in the family, everybody lost somebody, a dear loved one. That's a rough winter. They were all sick throughout the winter. There were times when there were barely anyone healthy enough to bury the dead, and those who had died. Terrible winter of suffering. In the spring, even their governor, John Carver, had died the first winter. They had to choose a new governor. William Bradford's who they choose, great man. He's the most famous pilgrim. We'll talk some more about him later. So in the spring, the captain of the Mayflower repairs the ship, says, I'm going back to England, all aboard. And the pilgrims looked at each other, they looked at him, they said, we can't go. That's not our home. We're going to stay here, try to make a life here in this new world, even after everything they've been through. See, the word pilgrim actually means kind of like wanderer or somebody with no place to call home. Isn't that exactly what these separatists are? That's why we call them pilgrims. England's not really their home. They're not welcome there. The Netherlands, they weren't at home there. All right, they came here. All right, they endured a dangerous storm. Half of them did not survive the first winter, but still they're determined. They're going to stay and carve out a life where they can worship God the way they see fit. They're going to make this their home. Again, what can we see about this group of people? I would say their faith is pretty important to them, right? Everything all they've already been through. So now we're into the spring of 1621, and things are going a little bit better. Things are going pretty well. They're learning from the Indians. In fact, get this, they run into an Indian that can speak English. Who am I talking about?
Pocahontas.
Not Pocahontas. She's down here in Virginia. Jamestown. Another famous Indian from back in the day. Squanto. Remember we talked last week about God's hand in history? There's some times where it's just so obvious that God played a role in American history. Well, here is an obvious example. We talked about God's providence. Remember that? God's providence means God is in control. Well, here is an obvious example. Do you know how many Indians there were in the entire North American continent in 1621 that could speak English? One. His name was Squanto. And wouldn't you know it, the Pilgrims land right in his neighborhood. Remember that storm that blew them off course? Of all the places that storm could have blown them on the coast, they ended up in the same neighborhood where the only Indian that speaks English is. And that Indian gives them some help, teaches them how to plant crops and how to make a living in this new world. I don't think that's an accident, do you?
No.
I think that's part of God's plan. Now, speaking of God's plan, let's talk about, just briefly, talk about Squanto's story. All right, as a young boy, he had been captured by English fishermen. Not English settlers, but there were fishermen from England that fished the waters of the North Atlantic, and they had once gone to the coast, and they captured Squanto and made him a slave. That's not a good life, is it? He was taken over to England, where he lived for a while, learned to speak English. That's how he learned to speak English. Eventually, he was granted his freedom, hitched a ride back to America, and he went looking for his long-lost family and his tribe. When he got back, no one from his tribe was still alive. Everyone, not just in his family, the whole tribe was dead. Now remember, there are dozens, maybe hundreds of different tribes of Native Americans. They all have a different language, different cultures, way of life, different belief systems. Of his people, there's no one still alive. No one that speaks his native language left on earth. Now what happened to them is they all died of a smallpox disease, a disease that can be deadly. And that virus was brought over to America by the Europeans. See, in Europe, that disease, smallpox, had been around for a while, so many Europeans had developed in their immune systems an immunity to it. But the Native Americans, their immune systems were not immune to smallpox. So smallpox wiped out huge numbers of Native Americans, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Native Americans died of smallpox, including all of Squanto's tribe. So he's alone in the world, but he can speak English. Alright, he kind of hooks up with a nearby tribe, makes the best of it, and then here comes the Pilgrims, blown off course. God hooks them up with the only Indian that can speak English. And he teaches them some valuable things on how to survive in this wilderness. Again, I don't think that's an accident. Now, thinking about Squanto's life, was that an easy life? No, my goodness. None of us have had it that hard. None of us have had it that bad. When we were captured as a child, sold into slavery, to finally get free and find out not only our whole family, but everyone we've ever known is dead. Now let me ask you something, God's providence. Did God cause those bad things to happen to Squanto? No, remember we said God can't cause bad things to happen because God is good. But did God allow those bad things to happen? He allowed it. Because again, God's in control. He's got a plan. He has the big picture. He knew that someday he was going to start this country, the United States of America, one nation under God that would be a force for good all over the planet in all kinds of ways. But in order to do that, he had to have these godly pilgrims come here. Then he had to get them blown off course and hook up with Squanto. So even in Squanto's tragic life, God used all those tragedies to fulfill his plan. We got a great God. He is in control. All right, well, that fall of 1621, the governor, the Pilgrim governor, by the way, on page, looks like page 24, there's a picture of a statue of him, William Bradford, most famous pilgrim ever. He says we are going to have a big celebration, feast. Now we're going to invite all our friends, which would be the Indians. In the fall of 1621, what do we call this big gathering?
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, this is Thanksgiving. We call it the first Thanksgiving, right? Hey, what a great tradition. Man, am I ever glad William Bradford came up with this. I love Thanksgiving. I mean, what's not to like, right? I mean, there's food, there's family, there's friends, there's football, everything good. It's a great day. I'd always eat too much.
Yeah, same.
I always eat too much. It's always one of the best meals of the year.
I'm not full after it. I'm still hungry.
Still hungry, even though you can't eat enough on Thanksgiving. Great tradition. Started in 1621 by William Bradford and the Pilgrims. I think your book gives you an idea what might have been on their menu. Might be a little different than ours, but I'm sure they had full bellies. Great day. And we call it Thanksgiving because who are they thanking?
Indians. No.
Who do we thank on Thanksgiving?
God.
Yeah, they were giving thanks to God. Now, time out, a couple of things about that. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are some schools, some textbooks that actually try to teach American history without bringing up God. Is that possible?
No.
That's kind of a big part of our story, isn't it? God is a big part of American history. Now, maybe someone might not believe in God, but to learn history, they would have to understand that the Pilgrims did believe in God, right? That's the story. I remember when my son was just a little toddler, and one of the very first times I took him to the library in Cape Coral, trying to get him into loving learning and reading, and since I'm a history teacher, right, he chose some books. I chose one on the first Thanksgiving. Right, we're flipping through it. You know how kid books are, right? It's mostly pictures, and maybe like one little sentence on each page. So we're flipping through there. He's looking at the pictures, and I'm reading it. And I read the one page, and it says that the Pilgrims and Indians thanked each other. Well, that's not the way I read it to my son. You know why? Because that's not how it happened. Thanksgiving was about thanking God. So this book, and many textbooks, and many public
Yeah,
schools,
that's what I read before.
they try to teach the story of the Pilgrims without mentioning God. Good luck with that. That's the whole point of the story. Why did the Pilgrims leave England to begin with? Why did they come to the New World? Because they wanted to worship God the way they see fit. Why did they even start the tradition of Thanksgiving? Because they were thankful to God for what He had blessed them with. That is the whole point of the story. All right, now let's think about the Pilgrims and the fact that they are thankful. 2020's been an interesting year, hasn't it? Not to mention just what's going on generally in our own lives. Maybe you've had a good year, maybe you've had not such a great year, but I promise you this, you have a lot to be thankful for. You have a tremendous amount to be thankful for. Don't be whining. Don't be that person that says, oh, poor me. I'm a victim of this, I'm a victim of that, I'm a victim of the system or whatever. There's a lot of that going on in our country right now. It always makes me angry. I feel like yelling at people. I don't. But I feel like yelling at people. You are not a victim. You are an American. You live in the greatest country in the world. You can achieve anything you want because of the freedoms that we have here. You're not a victim. Stop whining. Stop blaming other people. All right? Whatever's going wrong in your life, it is not someone else's fault. It is not something else's fault. You're responsible for what happens in your own life. All right? You're not a victim. The Pilgrims understood that. Let's think back to their last year, the year previous. All right? First of all, they couldn't live in England because they were persecuted. They couldn't live in Holland because of the wicked culture. They almost died in a storm coming over to the New World in the Mayflower. Then once they did get here, half of them did die. Everybody at that Thanksgiving had lost a dear loved one less than a year ago. And what are they doing? They're thanking God for His blessing in their life. If they can have an attitude of thankfulness, I guarantee you none of us in here have had that rough of a year. And if we have, it hadn't been any worse than theirs. If they can give thanks, we can give thanks. The Pilgrims understood there's always something to be thankful for. In everything, give thanks. Even when you're starting a new life in a harsh wilderness and half of the people you know have died in the last year, and you have no place to call home unless you make it here, there's a reason to be thankful. All right, if you look at your assignment,